We usually associate the Middle Ages with monumental stone castles and impregnable walls, but the reality of life for 99% of people looked completely different. Ordinary peasants lived in houses that a modern building inspector would immediately order demolished. And the most surprising detail of these structures was right above their heads. In this story, we'll break down the anatomy of this ingenious construction trick piece by piece. We'll see exactly how wind, snow, and fire forced these roofs to sacrifice themselves. You'll learn why losing half your house was sometimes the best news of the year. And to be honest, by the end of this story, you'll have a much greater respect for medieval peasants. Most of our ideas about the Middle Ages have been shaped by cinema and popular novels. We're used to seeing knights in movies galloping against the backdrop of massive stone citadels. This creates a persistent illusion that all of Europe was built up with impregnable fortresses. But the real picture of that time was far less grandiose and much dirtier. Stone was an incredibly expensive luxury, accessible only to kings and the highest aristocracy. Quarrying, transporting, and processing stone blocks required enormous resources and an army of skilled workers. An ordinary peasant could not afford even a stone foundation, let alone walls. His world was built of wood, clay, manure, and whatever was lying underfoot. A typical peasant's home consisted of a log frame filled with a mixture of clay and straw. Today we would call this eco-friendly construction, but back then it was the only way to survive. Building such a house took several months of backbreaking labor by the entire extended family. Every wooden peg driven into the ground cost people enormous physical effort and time. That is precisely why the house's load-bearing frame was the most valuable material possession in a peasant's life. If the walls rotted or the support posts fell, the family was effectively left out on the street. In the harsh conditions of a medieval winter, this meant almost certain death from hypothermia and disease. Losing the main wooden framework of the building was categorically, absolutely, and irrevocably unacceptable. But at the same time, the house had to be covered with something on top to protect against the rain. And here, builders faced their first serious survival dilemma. A heavy stone or tile roof would instantly crush the flimsy wooden walls under its weight. A light, accessible, and cheap material was needed, one that could be found right on the outskirts. The choice fell on straw, reeds, and thin tree branches. This material cost next to nothing, but required constant replacement. Such a roof weighed relatively little, retained heat perfectly in winter, and provided protection from the heat in summer. But it had one critical flaw, which the peasants turned into its main advantage. Straw lacked structural strength and could not maintain a rigid shape under extreme loads. Any modern builder would be horrified by such an unreliable roof. But for a person of the 13th century, this was not a problem, but a ready-made engineering solution. If the roof is weak, then it will break first and not drag the precious walls down with it. Imagine you're building a house of cards where the top cards are deliberately cut in half. If you press on them with your finger, they'll crumple, but the lower levels will remain standing. The logic of medieval house construction regarding thatched roofs worked exactly the same way. The roof was always a consumable material that no one intended to preserve for centuries. This is radically different from how we build our homes today. We try to make the roof just as strong and monolithic as the rest of the house. If a hurricane rips off our roof, it's considered a total disaster and grounds for an insurance payout. For a medieval person, seeing a roof blown away simply meant that there would be work to do tomorrow. Thus, the vulnerability of the roof was built into the very DNA of medieval architecture. People resigned themselves to the fact that their homes would periodically lose their roofs under the blows of the elements. It was a kind of tribute to nature for the opportunity to live in a warm and dry dwelling. And this arrangement, despite its harshness, worked perfectly for many centuries.
Nearly, my love.
To understand the full genius of the sacrificial roof, one must look inside a typical village house. In size, it rarely exceeded a modern two-car garage. In this cramped space, people slept, ate, worked, and often kept livestock. The family's entire life revolved around the central hearth, which provided heat and light. The walls of such a house were usually built using half timbering or simple wattle and daub construction. The frame consisted of thick oak beams joined by wooden pegs without a single nail. The space between the beams was filled with wattle and densely coated with a mixture of clay and cow manure. When this mixture dried, it became as hard as stone and effectively blocked drafts. Such walls could stand for decades if protected from direct exposure to water, but on their own, they did not have much resistance to lateral loads. If you were to push the wall hard with a bulldozer, it would simply collapse inward. Therefore, the upper part of the house was not supposed to create additional leverage on the frame. The roof was attached to the walls using a system of lightweight rafters made from young trees. These rafters were not nailed down tightly, but were tied together with ropes or flexible willow twigs. It sounds incredibly unreliable, like instructions for assembling furniture out of branches. But it was precisely this flexibility that held the key to the entire structure's survival. With rigid fastenings, any deformation of the roof would instantly be transferred to the load-bearing walls. If the rafters had been nailed down with iron nails, strong winds would have ripped them out along with pieces of the beams. The flexible rope fastenings worked like primitive shock absorbers in your car's suspension. They allowed the roof to sway and shift slightly, absorbing the energy of external impacts. A thick layer of straw, up to half a meter thick, was laid on top of these rafters. This layer was carefully tied down and sewn with wooden needles so it wouldn't blow away in a light breeze. But the overall strength of this grass-filled structure always remained lower than that of the walls. This was a deliberate strength limit, dictated by the very nature of the materials used. Modern engineers spend years calculating load limits using complex computer programs. Medieval carpenters achieved the same result through trial and error and very painful mistakes. Through experience, they figured out how thick the ropes needed to be to snap at the right moment. It was a perfect balance between reliability on an ordinary day and a life-saving collapse during a storm. The result was a structure consisting of two parts that were fundamentally different in nature. A rigid, expensive, and heavy foundation made of walls and central support pillars, and a light, flexible, cheap thatched roof ready to come loose at any moment. They worked together, but at a critical moment they easily separated, saving what mattered most. Even today, some types of traditional construction in Asia use similar principles for earthquake protection. Wooden pagodas are built without rigid fastenings, allowing the floors to slide and dampen ground vibrations. Medieval Europeans did not know the word seismic resistance, but their roofs served a similar purpose. They protected the house from destructive energy by absorbing the full impact themselves. This is how the anatomy of the classic peasant dwelling took shape, a structure that has survived to this day in museums. It is not merely a pile of clay and hay, but a finely tuned system of counterweights. And the first test of this system's strength was usually a powerful autumn storm. It was then that the roof's sacrificial function revealed itself in all its ruthless glory. Let's take another close look at the concept of intentional destruction, because it's mind-bending. In our modern culture, we're used to making things as durable and monolithic as possible. If your brand new smartphone bends in your pocket, you write angry reviews to the manufacturer. But in the world of engineering, the ability to break is sometimes the main indicator of a part's quality. Take a standard electrical fuse in your apartment's circuit breaker box. Its sole purpose in life is to blow and die when the voltage in the circuit becomes too high. If the fuse were made of a thick piece of copper, it would withstand the current surge. But then all your expensive appliances, and possibly the apartment itself, would burn down. A medieval thatched roof served exactly the same protective function, only on a much larger mechanical scale. It protected a peasant family's most valuable investment, the wooden frame of their home. Building new walls meant spending months cutting down trees, drying the wood, and erecting a log frame. A destroyed roof could be repaired in just a couple of days of collective work by the entire village. The peasants understood that they could not defeat the forces of nature with brute force and sturdy materials. They simply did not have concrete or steel beams to withstand hurricanes. So they used a judo-like tactic. They allowed the energy of the storm to pass through their house with minimal damage. They directed this destructive energy toward the cheapest and most easily replaceable part of the structure. If the builders had tried to secure the roof tightly, the consequences would have been fatal. Unable to tear off the roof, the wind would have begun to rock the entire house. The wooden beams would have popped out of their grooves, the clay would have crumbled, and the walls would have collapsed right on top of the people. In trying to save cheap straw, the peasants would have lost their home and their own lives. It sounds like a paradox, but the roof's weakness was what guaranteed safety for the people inside. At a critical moment, it is better to be caught in a downpour within 4 sturdy walls than under the rubble. Wet clothes and spoiled grain supplies are problems that can be solved. A rib cage crushed by a beam is a problem that was impossible to solve in the Middle Ages. Today, this principle is used everywhere in the most advanced fields of engineering and design. Automotive engineers create crumple zones so that the kinetic energy of an impact crushes the metal, not the passengers. Skyscraper architects design special weak links that break during an earthquake, preserving the main structure. We consider this the pinnacle of human thought and technical progress. But the truth is that illiterate peasants of the 14th century arrived at this solution much earlier. They had no laboratories, sensors, or wind tunnels to conduct complex tests. They had only the harsh school of life, where the price of a mistake was always death. And this school taught them that sometimes the best way to survive is to give in at the right moment and let go of the situation. Thus, a primitive, thatched roof became the prototype for complex modern safety systems. It proved that flexibility and a willingness to sacrifice the small are often more effective than blind resistance. This was the first instance in history of the widespread application of the mechanical safety mechanism principle in architecture. And it worked so reliably that it outlasted the Middle Ages itself. To understand what medieval roofs were up against, you need to grasp the power of ordinary wind. For us, the wind is just an annoying nuisance that messes up our hair on the way to work. But for a house standing in an open area, the wind is an invisible bulldozer pressing down with incredible force. And the shape of a thatched roof was ideally suited to catching this pressure. The shape of a traditional village roof usually resembled a tall and fairly steep pyramid. This design was necessary so that rainwater would run off quickly and not cause the straw to rot. But this steepness had a very unpleasant side effect in terms of aerodynamics. The tall, wide roof turned into a giant sail stretched over the house. Imagine an old ship caught in a violent storm with its sails fully hoisted. The mast would not withstand the wind pressure and would simply snap in half, dragging the ship to the bottom. That is why sailors always lower their sails during a storm, reducing the surface area exposed to the wind. But a farmer couldn't lower his roof before the onset of an autumn hurricane. The house stood in place and was forced to bear the full brunt of the wind front. The pressure on the windward side of the roof increased to enormous levels with every passing second. At the same time, a low-pressure zone formed on the opposite side, which literally sucked the roof outward. This combination of pushing and pulling forces could tear any rigid structure to pieces. If the walls and roof had been fastened with iron bolts, the house would have turned into a lever. The wind would have pressed against the roof's sail, and the roof in turn would have torn the walls from the ground. A log frame without a deep concrete foundation would not have withstood such an onslaught. The entire structure would simply have toppled over on its side, like a house of cards in a draft. But here, the very weakness of the fastenings and materials that had been planned came into play. When the wind pressure exceeded a critical threshold, the ropes and thin rafters began to creak and snap. The wind literally blew the straw away in chunks, gradually reducing the area of that very sail. With every armful of hay torn away, the load on the load-bearing walls rapidly decreased. In the most severe storms, the roof could be torn off entirely, leaving the house completely bare. It looked catastrophic, and the family inside was guaranteed to get soaked to the skin in the downpour. But as soon as the sail disappeared, the wind lost its main point of support on the building. The walls remained standing, whole and unharmed, because nothing was pressing down on them from above anymore. It was a perfect system for automatically releasing excess pressure, devised centuries before the advent of physics. The wind itself destroyed whatever stood in its way, leaving the most important parts untouched. Modern building codes require that the roof of a hurricane-resistant house be firmly anchored to the foundation with steel cables. The medieval approach was exactly the opposite. Let it fly away as long as it doesn't touch the walls. That is precisely why, after severe storms, medieval villages looked as if they had been bombed. The fields were littered with pieces of straw, broken branches, and scraps of rope. But the houses themselves remained standing, and smoke continued to rise from the chimneys. People went outside, assessed the damage, sighed heavily, and set off to gather new reeds.
We have no coin for timber.
The sale effect was the main enemy of the peasant house throughout the fall and spring. But thanks to an ingenious trick involving fragile fastenings, this enemy always won only halfway. It took the building's outer layer, but could not reach its wooden frame. And in the harsh reality of that time, this was considered an unconditional and unquestionable victory. While the wind tried to tear off the roof and carry it away to a neighboring kingdom, winter posed a different threat. Snow moved more slowly, more quietly, but that did not make it any less deadly for peasant dwellings. The main problem with snow was its weight, which many people today greatly underestimate. And for the fragile rafters of a thatched roof, this weight became a real test of strength. We're used to seeing fluffy snow that can be easily brushed off a car windshield with a mitten. But when this snow settles on a roof in a thick layer and becomes saturated with moisture, it turns into lead. A single cubic meter of wet snow can weigh up to 800 kilograms of pure, deadly pressure. And the area of a typical peasant roof collected dozens of such heavy cubes over the course of a winter. Here, the steep slope of the thatched roof once again played a vital role in saving the building. A slope of 45 degrees or more caused the snow to slide down under its own weight. It was a primitive self-cleaning mechanism that worked without electricity or human intervention. But during periods of heavy and prolonged snowfall, even this mechanism sometimes failed. When snow accumulated on the straw too quickly, it began to freeze into heavy, monolithic blocks. These icy slabs pressed down on the rafters with incredible force, threatening to crush the entire house. And again, as with the wind, a rigidly fixed monolithic roof would become a deadly weapon. All that colossal weight would be transferred to the supporting posts, causing them to crack and break. If the central pillar of the house breaks, the entire structure instantly collapses inward, burying people under the rubble of timber. But the sacrificial roof was designed to prevent this worst-case scenario. The rafters were thin enough to bend and break before the main walls gave way. The roof literally caved in, taking the critical load off the building's frame. Yes, a roof that caved in meant a snowdrift the size of a bear suddenly appeared in the living room. Yes, it meant bitter cold, ruined belongings, and the need to urgently clear the debris in the middle of the night. But the fallen thin poles and bundles of straw rarely caused fatal injuries to the occupants below. The main heavy oak beams remained in place, securely holding the walls from collapsing. This was yet another example of how the structure's programmed weakness saved human lives. The collapsed roof acted as a pressure relief valve, protecting the architectural skeleton. People could wait out the rest of the winter by stretching animal hides or thick fabric over the hole. Repairing the roof in the spring was difficult, but rebuilding a house crushed to splinters was impossible. Interestingly, modern building codes in snowy regions require incredibly strong roof truss systems. We use reinforced steel beams that can support the weight of a small tank on the roof. Medieval people took a completely different approach, making no attempt to fight the massive frozen water. They let gravity do its work, but directed the force of destruction into a safe channel. Sometimes the peasants themselves helped the roof collapse if they saw that a critical amount of snow had accumulated. Using long poles, they knocked the ice crusts off from the inside, deliberately breaking some of the fastenings to lighten the load. It was a deliberate architectural amputation to save the entire living structure. It sounds gruesome, but in a world without emergency services, it was the only strategy available. The snow trap proved that medieval builders understood perfectly well the difference between inconvenience and disaster. Snow collapsing into a house is a massive inconvenience, and a lot of swearing in Old English. Family members crushed by a log meant the end of the family line and a complete catastrophe. The sacrificial roof always chose the first option, proving its grim effectiveness. Wind and snow were serious trials, but they paled in comparison to the absolute horror of the Middle Ages. That horror was fire, a silent, swift, and utterly merciless enemy of wooden towns and villages. A fire could start from a stray ember, an overturned splinter, or a lightning strike during a storm. And when a spark landed on a dry thatched roof, it was a matter of seconds. Straw dried by the hot summer sun ignited like gunpowder and burned at a monstrous temperature. It was, in fact, the perfect kindling, neatly stacked above the heads of sleeping people. Modern fire departments classify such materials as having the highest fire hazard rating. Living under a thatched roof was like sleeping on a powder keg with an open fire in the center of the room.
Papa, I'm scared.
It was precisely in the event of a fire that the concept of the sacrificial roof revealed its darkest and most paradoxical potential. Once the straw caught fire, it was already impossible to save the roof with any amount of buckets of water. The main task was to prevent the fire from spreading to the wooden frame of the house and to save the people. And the weakness of the roof's fastenings once again became the only chance for survival. The fire quickly burned through the thin ropes and willow rods that secured the rafters to the load-bearing beams. And as soon as these connecting links disappeared, the burning roof ceased to rest on the walls. It simply collapsed into the house, falling directly onto the earthen floor as one huge blazing mass. At first glance, this seems like the most terrible scenario of all. But in reality, it was a brilliant solution to the problem of a roof fire spreading. When the burning roof falls to the ground, people are able to extinguish it right at their feet. Climbing up onto the burning roof with buckets is practically impossible due to the heat and smoke. But trampling down the fallen straw on the floor and dousing it with water was a perfectly feasible task. Moreover, the rapid collapse of the roof saved the load-bearing oak beams of the frame from prolonged exposure to fire. The thin rafter branches burned through and fell before the thick wood had time to catch fire seriously. The frame charred slightly and turned black, but retained its structural integrity and strength. The house lost its hair, but its skull remained intact and functional. If the roof had been fastened with iron nails, it would have hung there and burned to the very end. The heat from the straw would have transferred to the thick logs, and the entire house would have burst into flames like a giant torch. Then there would have been no chance of saving the walls and foundation. The fire would have consumed everything. And worse still, the flames would have easily spread to neighboring houses, destroying the entire village. The collapse of the roof inward also contained the source of the fire, preventing sparks from flying in all directions. It was a primitive form of fire containment, relying on gravity and the rapid breakdown of structural connections. It sounds crazy, but it's better to have a blazing fire inside 4 clay walls than a giant torch above them. The walls kept the heat inside while people tried to put out the flames. It was precisely because of the threat of fire in some regions that peasants began laying a layer of turf under the straw. When the roof collapsed, the earth from the turf fell onto the fire and helped extinguish it more quickly. It was a true medieval fire suppression system, built right into the structure of the house itself. It worked only once, but that one time was enough to save lives. The threat of fire shaped the strict philosophy of medieval construction. Don't try to save what burns easily. Focus on ensuring that the fire takes only the cheapest part of your property. The sacrificial roof handled this task perfectly, taking the fire upon itself and collapsing downward. It died quickly so that the wooden heart of the peasant house could continue to beat. Another crucial aspect of the sacrificial roof is the speed with which it could be put back in place. In the medieval world, time was as valuable a resource as food or firewood for the winter. If your roof blew off in late fall, you didn't have weeks to wait for a construction crew. You needed to patch the hole in your house before the first frost hit and the snow fell. And this is where the modular, lightweight nature of a thatched roof showed its best qualities. Repairing a damaged roof didn't require complex blueprints, calculations, or waiting for mortar to dry. It was a quick, almost mechanical process that the village could complete in record time. And the key word here is precisely village, because such problems were solved only collectively. When a hurricane tore the roof off one of the houses, all the neighbors, without exception, came to help. This was not merely charity, but a strict social contract for survival within the community. Today they help you repair your roof, and tomorrow the wind will tear the straw from their house. Under conditions of collective responsibility, the speed of work increased tenfold. While some men were reinstalling the thin rafters and tying them with fresh ropes, others carried the thatch. Women and teenagers tied bundles of reeds and passed them up to the roofers. The work proceeded like a modern assembly line, quickly, smoothly, and without wasted motion. An experienced village team could completely rethatch a small house in just 1 or 2 days. Try to imagine restoring a collapsed stone or tile roof. You would have to call a craftsman, order new clay tiles, fire them in a kiln, and transport them by cart. This would take many weeks, during which the family would simply freeze to death. Straw, on the other hand, allowed the problem to be solved with minimal disruption to daily life. That is precisely why the concept of fragility was so closely linked to the concept of maintainability. Engineers know the golden rule. If something is bound to break often, it must be easy to fix. Medieval peasants intuitively built their architecture around this most important rule. They didn't try to create a perpetual motion machine. They created a machine that could be repaired in the field on the spot. Even if a portion of the old straw was blown away by the wind, one could always use spare hay from the barn, or, as a last resort, cut reeds from the nearest river, even if they weren't the driest. The main thing was to create a barrier between the living space and the cold autumn sky. Beauty and aesthetics took a back seat when survival was at stake. This rapid cycle of destruction and reconstruction shaped the unique mindset of the people of that era. They did not view natural disasters as the end of the world or a reason to give up. To them, a collapsed roof was simply another everyday task, much like chopping wood or repairing a cart. Nature struck, the house took the blow, people fixed everything, and life went on as usual. In the modern world, we often lose the ability to deal with the aftermath of disaster so quickly. Our infrastructure is too complex for non-specialists to fix in a couple of days. The medieval approach to construction gave people incredible self-sufficiency and independence from complex systems. They were their own architects, rescuers, and repairmen all rolled into one. The speed of recovery turned a collapsed roof from a catastrophe into a mere inconvenience. It was the perfect balance between vulnerability to the elements and the ability to quickly heal wounds. And this ability to quickly return to normal was the main secret to the survival of all humanity in those dark ages. We have arrived at the main conclusion from this whole story of broken roofs and blown away straw. Modern people often look at the past with an undisguised sense of technological superiority. We smile condescendingly at the primitive tools and strange architectural solutions of the Middle Ages. It seems to us that the people of that time were ignorant, narrow-minded, and had absolutely no understanding of physics. But the story of the sacrificial roof shatters this arrogant myth to smithereens, revealing the true nature of our ancestors. Medieval builders were not fools. They were masters of intuitive engineering under conditions of total scarcity. They didn't have structural mechanics courses at universities, but they had the world's best teacher. Ruthless experience. And this experience forced them to think in terms that modern science has only recently arrived at. They understood the concept of load distribution long before the term appeared in textbooks. They invented a mechanical safety mechanism for buildings when sophisticated machinery didn't yet exist. They used the principles of aerodynamics to protect their homes from wind forces. All of this was done with dirty hands, axes, and an incredibly sharp mind. Your modern office job probably requires a college degree and knowledge of complex computer programs. But try designing a house out of mud and sticks so that it doesn't kill you in the winter. It turns out that an illiterate peasant from the 13th century knew more about the practical strength of materials than you do. And his solutions were not dictated by ignorance, but by a profound understanding of the properties of the world around him. We have forgotten this genius of our ancestors because we have surrounded ourselves with excessive technology and endless resources. We can afford the luxury of building thick walls capable of withstanding any storm without collapsing. We have concrete, steel, Kevlar, and composite materials that forgive almost any architectural mistake. But take these materials away from us, and we won't even be able to build a decent shed. That is precisely why studying historical technologies is not just a pastime for lovers of antiquity. It is a way to understand how the human brain solves complex problems with minimal input. A thatched roof is a monument to human ingenuity, just as important as Gothic cathedrals. It's just that cathedrals were built for the glory of God, while thatched roofs were built for the survival of ordinary people. When we laugh at the primitiveness of the past, we are laughing at the foundation of our own present. All of our modern crumple zones in cars grew out of those very same flimsy wooden rafters. Our entire concept of risk management stems from the decision to sacrifice straw to save the walls. We've simply given ancient ideas new fancy names and wrapped them in plastic. So the next time you see a thatched roof in a historical film, don't think of poverty. Think of the brilliant engineering calculation behind it. Think of the thousands of lives saved because someone had the sense not to drive the nail in too deep. Hidden within this apparent weakness lay the colossal power of human intellect. And perhaps in our complex world, we should recall this medieval lesson more often. Sometimes you don't need to fight the storm by building impenetrable concrete walls around yourself. Sometimes the smartest decision is to let the wind tear away the excess so that what matters most remains standing on the ground. As we wrap up our journey into the world of medieval engineering, I'd like to pause on one important thought. The history of human development is not always a linear progression from the worst to the best. Sometimes it is a spiral, where old forgotten principles return to us in a new form. And the history of intentionally weak roofs is the best proof of this paradoxical theory. We have seen how harsh reality forced people to make counterintuitive but life-saving decisions. A roof built to break sounds absurd to a modern architect, but for a peasant, it was the math of survival. Lose 10% of one's property to save 90. It was a cruel game of chance with nature, in which man found a way to cheat in his own favor. The wind blew the straw away, depriving the house of its sail-like effect and saving the load-bearing walls from complete collapse. Snow broke through the flimsy rafters, shifting the critical weight inward and preserving the building's wooden frame. Fire burned through the ropes and fell to the ground, unable to turn the house into a blazing torch. Each time, the structure's weakness functioned as a perfect defense mechanism against total destruction. Today, we live in a world obsessed with the idea of absolute invulnerability and total control over the environment. We try to make our systems rigid, monolithic, and resistant to any external shocks. But when such a rigid system breaks, it usually collapses entirely, burying us under the rubble. Perhaps we lack that very medieval flexibility and willingness to accept small, controlled losses. After all, true strength does not lie in never breaking under the blows of fate and the elements. True strength lies in breaking correctly, in the right places, and with minimal consequences. Medieval roofs did exactly that. They heroically sacrificed themselves to save lives. And for that, they deserve not our mockery, but our sincere admiration for their brilliant creators.